What is music? Do you ever wonder about that? I mean, why does it speak to us? Does it speak to us really? Is music a language? Am I just imagining that it's speaking to me, suggesting things, making me feel certain ways? Do you ever wonder about that? Well, the answer is that you're not crazy, and music does speak to us. Music is a language, and composers know that language and know how to work with it. And that's how we compose music. Whether it's classical, whether it's rock, whether it's instrumental, whether it's jazz, whatever music you listen to, it uses the language of music. And I want to show you some of the wonders of that language to help you understand it better, how it works, and inform you about its very existence. The way to do that is to looking at classical music. Now, the reason we need to look at classical music in order to see that is because in classical music, what really is classical music? Classical music was when composers took a very serious endeavor to explore music purely instrumentally, on page, in a very serious way. They studied music like never before. And they devoted themselves to figuring out the ultimate nature of music. And doing it on instruments helped them because, you know, when you compose music for singing, for vocals, for churches, for festivals, then the music always has something it needs to serve. It needs to fit this, it needs to fit that. But when you compose music for instruments, it allows you to develop the music without the limitations of, let's say, the human voice or what it needs to express now. But you're able to study the very nature of music. And that is why classical music became the deepest study we ever did into the very essence of music. Music itself, sound, tones, scale, and so on. That's why I want to show you now, we'll lead you through 4 wonderful periods in music history, which is basically the whole classical music period, but they're divided into 4 different periods, where each period gave us new innovations, ideas of how to compose music, of how the possibilities of music, and those possibilities are with us until today, things that we see in the music all around us. And now I want to lead you through those wonderful times. The Renaissance, and by this I mean the 1600s, was the start of what we would call now classical music, meaning the process of developing instrumental music to the very deep level by which they went in classical music. If you think about it, most songs that you notice that they tend to have a form. They have a beginning part, sometimes a middle part, and a later part. They can be divided into 3 parts, 2 parts. Well, you have multiple sections in many songs. And that is called musical form. There's a reason for it, and that is that when you want to build more than a musical sentence, you want to build a musical world, then you have different parts to it. Now, in classical music, one of the things that defines classical music is indeed form. I'm sure you've all heard names like sonatas, concertos, variations, and whatever else. These are all names of forms, which in other words means like a blueprint on which the composer writes his music. You know, he knows there's this and there's that. He needs to find a place which to start from, a place to contrast it, a place to come back to, and things like that. Now, in the Renaissance, when they began that process, one of the first forms they came out with is something called variations. Now, variations is a wonderful idea. You all know the word variations, I'm sure. That is different options for the same thing. And variations is basically like this. You're a composer, you just composed a melody. Now, you could have gone in many different directions with that melody. You didn't have to choose it the way you did. You could have made it slightly more dancey and jumpier. You could have decided for it to be slower, faster, higher, slightly neighboring notes. You have all kinds of different options. And you choose on what you think is best. But in your head, you walk around with many other options you could have gone with. So variations basically says, I'm going to give you my melody, and then I'm going to give you another version of that melody. And then yet another version, and then another version. And that's what variations are. They're like a series of different options for the same thing. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that it's really showing you how much is contained in one thing that you chose. You have many different ways of going about it. To me, it reminds me very much of our lives in general. which we have to choose one way. We can't choose every way. We have many different potentials. We can choose to do this with our life, we can choose to do that with our lives, but we have to choose one way. But that doesn't mean that you're losing out on everything else, because in what you do, you have ingrained within it is who you really are. And that's, in a way, everything that you could have been otherwise is ingrained in what you chose to do nonetheless, if you do it fully, of course. And that reminds me very much of variations, which is you choose one melody, but then you show me that there's many different variations, so to speak, nested realities within the same thing. And it's a wonderful idea. I've always enjoyed very much seeing in one simple sentence you thought that's it. But then he shows you, no, you think about it contains a possibility like that. And then he shows you contains a possibility like that. Now, after all this speaking, I should show you what I mean by that. And I'll play you now the first ever piece of that style that I just described that was ever written. It was written by someone called Luis de Narvaez from Spain. He wrote it for an instrument called the vihuela, which was similar to the guitar. Nowadays we play it on the guitar. Now, the Baroque was the start of really what was to come until nowadays. As you saw in the last period, in the Renaissance, they began the initiative of the instrumental music and looking for all these new musical forms and complexity you can build with music, with the language of music. And now in the Baroque, it really all fell into place and the puzzle was finally finished. And now music sounded like never before. Music was connected and you can have arguments and questions and answers and everything sounded connected like the music before didn't. If you listen to music which was written up till the 1600s, 1700s, you'll see that they sound a bit strange to our ears. Because there's something that was still missing in how we understood how the language of music works. But now, in the Baroque period, which we're talking about, the end of the 1600s, beginning of the 1700s, that's the time of famous composers like Bach and Vivaldi and Scarlatti. And there's a reason they're much more famous than whoever came before. I can't even name you a famous one from the Renaissance so much. And that is because the Baroque period really took off like never before. And music was suddenly flowing in cycles. And you know how we know in songs today that you have, chords which seem to follow so naturally one from another. Many songs, entire melodies are built on these cycles of chords which come back. That's all from that period. And that's the music of that time itself. They celebrated all those new discoveries. And their music is not so much focused on creating a nice melody or a nice simple musical idea. They were so fascinated with what music can build on top of each other, the multi-layered integration of music, that most of the music is like that. You will see most of the music, you will take an idea, then copy it, then suddenly it will flow into a cycle, and it will build, and the same idea will return in many different ways. That's what their music was about. It was almost as if existence was allowed to speak, and they were just fascinated with the very nature of music. It's very existential music, and people tend to feel that way about Bach's music in particular, that it's not so much expressing a specific nice idea, but rather that it's sort of as if music is speaking to you, as if existence is speaking to you. And they wanted to allow that to happen. And they loved creating music which showed you how you can take one idea and it will reappear in a different voice on top of each other, work counter to each other. And that was the marvelous music that they left for us. And now I'll show you some of their music. I'll start with a beautiful piece by Scarlatti, who was an Italian composer. And you'll see in this piece how he took this one musical motif and then he transfers it to different places, higher tones, lower tones, and he builds a whole universe out of that theme. And he was the master composer of creating pieces which are so thematic. All they need is one sentence and he'll show you how to create a whole universe out of it. That reminds me also so much about how in our lives all you need is one idea, one person with consistency, and looking for integration, you can create a whole universe out of it. And now for a wonderful piece by Bach himself. This is a piece which you can beautifully see how he plays two lines of music on top of each other, and they contrast each other. One goes up, one goes down. That's called the music counterpoint. They're going counter to each other, and nevertheless they create a beautiful harmony together. The classical period was the time of fancy music. Do you know those waltzes that you would hear in movies when they want to show you pretentious high society? That's what I'm speaking about. The ultimate fancy classical music that you can think of. Why is that? You see, the period before, the Baroque period, was the time when they discovered all the complexity and the very nature of music, as I explained to you in the video before. And now in the classical period, they took all of that. They took all that we understood about music and they packaged it up nicely so that you can consume it easily. Because the music from the Baroque period is very heavy to hear. Go listen to Bach, Vivaldi, it's intense. I love hearing it, but it wasn't exactly easy listening. It's wild, it's endless, you don't know where it's going necessarily. In the classical period, they invented musical predictability. Now you can hear a sentence and predict where it's going to go. You see, you can't really memorize a tune from a classical piece from the Baroque period, but you can easily do that to a classical period. And in fact, most ringtones nowadays from classical music come from the classical period. The reason for that is that in this period I invented musical symmetry, something which nowadays in music you most likely find in most of our music, and that is, you can even notice on your Spotify if you check, that the first part of a musical sentence and the second part of a musical sentence will in most cases be equally as long as each other. I want to show you examples of musical symmetry. Look at this. Let's look, for example, at a famous song by Billy Joel. Now look at this again. See the first part of the sentence, which I would call the suggestion or the question. Until here, and now comes the response to that, which you'll notice is equally as long. Now that is called musical symmetry. I'll show you how they did that in the classical period, which we're discussing now, for example by something from Mozart. You could see that the sentence is very equally divided in its first part and the second part. Now we take it for granted nowadays, and that's indeed what makes songs predictable to us and easy to sing. But it wasn't at once, and the classical period is really when they introduced us to that idea. And that is what I'm trying to show you here in this whole presentation, is where our ideas that we can take for granted nowadays in music, they all come from somewhere. The specific period when they specialized in those ideas and invented them, founded them, and gave them to us forever. The Romantic period took music to a new place it hasn't been before. And that is that it started focusing on expressivity, on expressing very specific emotions. As you may notice with music in general, that when you look at music from different periods in history, they tend to resemble the culture that surrounds them, the ideas that you have in literature and art and politics at the time. And they resemble the way that people live and the way that people see things. So in the Romantic period, that's also the case. And there's a focus now on nationality, there's a focus on emotion, and the music reflects that. The Romantic music is much more focused towards expressing a very specific idea to you, rather than music we saw in the Classical period or the Baroque period, where it's more about a certain entity of music itself. But now Romantic music is speaking directly to you. It's focused on great expressive moments. And it's another thing that you have in Romantic music is music which creates very specific experiences, meaning that it can be a piece of music which isn't focused so much on saying that or that, or on having a very specific structure, but being just an experience on its own. And now I would like to play you some of those pieces. I'll start with a waltz, which is a beautiful example of a romantic piece of music which speaks to you. It's romantic, that's what we can call it. And it's still classical music, you can see the structure in the chords, but that's really where we got the idea of very expressive instrumental music. This waltz is composed by someone who was named Reis. It's called Ela Perguntar. In this beautiful piece called Recuerdos de la Alhambra, you'll see what I described to you as music which creates a very specific experience. Now, this was written by Francisco Tarrega as a tribute to the famous Alhambra Palace in Granada, which is a very serene place, and he creates the same feeling within his music.